Hi, Modern World History students. We are continuing with Unit 9A, the Cold War in Europe and Asia, and this is Section 4, Stalin's Violations of the Yalta Agreements. I hope you'll be able to explain why Joseph Stalin was determined to maintain Soviet control over Eastern Europe and how he took steps to ensure this, and how this in turn led to the outbreak of the Cold War in Europe. So, you'll learn about the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. We'll talk about the Iron Curtain, and we'll also mention the free world versus the Soviet bloc or communist bloc. So we're moving on to the top of page 8. And remember that in the Yalta agreements, Joseph Stalin had signed on to something called the Declaration of Liberated Europe. And what that stated was that the nations of Eastern Europe, and really all of Europe, were to be free. That is, they were supposed to be able to choose their own governments through free elections, and that they were to be free of military occupation by the forces of the Allied powers, but that this was delayed by a year. So the deal was that in Eastern Europe, Soviet forces would continue to occupy the states that they had taken over in the last months of World War II, but after a year, Soviet forces were to withdraw, and the communist governments, which had been installed by the Soviets in those Eastern European countries, were now supposed to allow free elections so that those nations could choose their own futures and choose their own governments. The United States and Britain had agreed to this one-year period of Soviet occupation and this one-year period of communist dictatorship rule in Eastern Europe as a sort of a compromise with Stalin. You have to remember that what Joseph Stalin wanted was for Eastern Europe to remain as much under the control of the Soviet Union as possible. Remember that 3 times in the previous 150 years, Russia or the Soviet Union had been invaded by strong armies coming out of Western Europe. Stalin wanted to maintain Soviet control over Eastern Europe, to use it as a kind of a barrier or shield or buffer zone to protect the Soviet Union from a future invasion. And so what Stalin wanted to ensure was that Eastern Europe would be militarily strong and also friendly to the Soviet Union. And what that meant to him was that Eastern Europe needed to be communist. And so when Soviet forces had moved into those countries at the end of World War II, they had installed communist dictatorships. Now, again, what the Western countries, what Britain and the United States wanted, was for those nations to be free to choose their own governments and their own futures. And so that's why you ended up with this sort of compromise at Yalta, in which the Americans and British agreed that there would continue to be Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe and communist rule in Eastern Europe for a year. But on the other hand, Stalin agreed that after that year, Soviet forces would be withdrawn and free elections would be held. Well, what that meant was that by the end of the year 1946, those Soviet forces should have been withdrawn from Eastern Europe, and those free elections should have been held. But the war came to an end, and the year flipped over from 1945 to 46. And as the year 1946 progressed, it became increasingly clear that Stalin had no intention of removing Soviet forces from Eastern Europe. They were supposed to be removed by the end of the year 1946, and as a matter of fact, they were not removed until 1989. So Soviet forces remained in Eastern Europe an additional 43 years beyond the 1 year that they were supposed to be present there. As a matter of fact, it was quite the opposite. Rather than decreasing Soviet control over Eastern Europe, Stalin moved to consolidate it. And one of the ways that he did that was by building these barbed wire barriers. Wherever there was a border, a boundary between a communist state and a non-communist state, Soviet soldiers began to construct these barriers. And you can see what they consist of. This is sort of it's a barbed wire fence. And see how it's a T-shaped barbed wire fence, so that even if somebody attempted to climb up it somehow, they would find barbed wire over their heads as well as in front of them. And that fence continued all along the borders for hundreds of miles all along the borders separating communist states of Eastern Europe from the non-communist states of Western Europe. You can also see on the eastern side of the fence a guard tower, which would have been manned by Soviet troops who would have had searchlights and machine guns in order to ensure that no one was attempting to breach that barrier. And you can also see that there's a road that runs alongside the barrier. And that would have been patrolled by Soviet troops in cars or jeeps or trucks or something like that. So you get the idea. Stalin was supposed to be removing Soviet forces from Eastern Europe, but it was very clear by the end of the year 1946 that he had no intentions of doing that. And quite the opposite. He was, by creating these barriers, consolidating Soviet control over Eastern Europe, not releasing Eastern Europe from Soviet control, but actually increasing Soviet control there. And of course, the Soviets very tightly controlled passage across these barriers. There were only limited places where people could go from one side to the other, and the Soviets controlled very carefully who could enter in and who could leave. And then, of course, not surprisingly, the other side of that was that they did not hold the free elections. Free elections, remember, were to be held in 1946, so that the nations of Eastern Europe could choose for themselves whether to retain communism, whether they had been won over to communism in that year or so. They could have chosen to retain it if they wanted to, or whether to choose some other form of government, some other way of managing their economy. But those free elections were never held. The communist dictatorships, which were supported by the Soviet Union and the Soviet Army in Eastern Europe, did not conduct those free elections. So really, in every possible way, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin's leadership, violated the agreements that they had made at Yalta really just a year and a half prior to that time. Stalin did not keep the promises that he had made to Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. Now remember, by this time, Churchill was no longer Prime Minister of Great Britain anyway. And you're going to learn that over your lifetime that political leaders who are sort of retired, they spend time going around making speeches. And Churchill actually visited the United States. And during his visit to the United States, he was making a speech in Missouri. And he came up with a sort of a metaphor to describe this boundary that had been laid down between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. He referred to it as an iron curtain. And this sort of political cartoon that you see in the lower right-hand corner shows an iron curtain or an iron wall having been constructed across Europe. And that's the way that Churchill said it, from Stettin in the Baltic, that's a northern part of Europe, to Trieste in the Adriatic, that's a southern part. So from north to south, a great iron curtain has descended across the continent. And it was a really good metaphor because an iron curtain is impenetrable. You cannot penetrate it. And the Soviets had built this barrier and had made it seemingly impenetrable, backed up as it was by Soviet troops. You can't see what's going on the other side. And this was certainly true. Stalin was a very secretive person. He was not the kind of person who believed in sharing information with others, even when perhaps retrospectively we might realize it might have been to his benefit to share information with others. And it's ominous. We don't know exactly why this iron curtain has been constructed, but it's causing fear for us. So an iron curtain is impenetrable. You don't know what's going on the other side. It creates a sense of mystery about what's going on the other side, perhaps fear about what's going on the other side, and it's ominous. And so Iron Curtain was actually a pretty good metaphor for what had happened in Europe because of Stalin's decisions. And that became, when those of us who grew up during the Cold War, myself, your parents, others, when we heard the phrase Iron Curtain, or when we even used the phrase Iron Curtain, we talked about what was going on the other side of the Iron Curtain. That's what we thought about. We thought about how the world, not just Europe, but ultimately the whole world had become divided really into two groups. There was the free world. Now that was the part of the world that was led by the United States, It was the part of the world where you had democratic governments or non-communist governments. It was the part of the world where people were free to make their own economic choices and their own personal choices. And so we referred to the part of the world led by the United States as the free world. The part of the world that was communist under dictatorships and led by the Soviet Union, we referred to that part of the world as the Soviet bloc or the communist bloc. And that's how we came to see the world. We grew up in a world that seemed to be divided in two. You were either part of the free world or you were part of the communist bloc. Now, there were some countries that did not consider themselves part of either. But when the United States looked at those countries and saw that they claimed that they were part of neither, we sort of assumed that they were with the communists. And when the communists looked at those countries that claimed that they were part of neither, they assumed that they were on our side. So they were kind of left in a sort of a no man's land, because people in the United States and in the Soviet Union, certainly the leaders of the governments of the United States and the Soviet Union, saw the world as being divided into those two groups. You're either with us or you're with them. And then this divide, this iron curtain between us, represented the inability of the two sides to sort of come together on anything. We were divided, and it seemed at that time we were sort of divided permanently. So I want to move on to section 5, containment and the Truman Doctrine. And through this section, I hope you'll be able to explain how the United States then responded to this sense of being threatened, to the sense of fear that was created when Stalin did what he did. This threat that communism might perhaps even expand into other parts of Europe. And you're going to learn about a policy called containment, a communist revolt in Greece and Turkey, an additional policy called the Truman Doctrine. You're going to meet Secretary of State George Marshall and hear about the Marshall Plan. So now I am taking you to the bottom of page 8. So here was the thing. In retrospect, we now understand that in all likelihood, what Joseph Stalin really wanted when he sort of sealed off Eastern Europe and built the Iron Curtain and refused to withdraw Soviet troops from Eastern Europe and refused to allow free elections there, we now understand that probably what he was really looking for was simply security. Security for the Soviet Union against the potential of some future invasion. The problem is, as I mentioned before, Joseph Stalin was an extremely secretive person. He always believed that it was a disadvantage to him to share information with others, and that it was an advantage to him to keep information from others. Well, the problem is, because of that, he never really made his intentions clear about why he was doing what he was doing in Eastern Europe. He did not share those intentions with the United States, or really anybody else, other than his own, tight little group of advisors. Had he done so, perhaps the reaction of the United States and the rest of the free world to the building of the Iron Curtain and his violations of the Yalta agreements might have been less alarmed. We might have still disagreed. We might have still been upset that the people of Eastern Europe were not going to be free, but it might not have generated the kind of fear that it did in the United States and in Western Europe had he made his intentions more clear. Had he said, look, this country has been invaded 3 times in the last 150 years by powerful armies coming out of Western Europe. They passed through Eastern Europe really without any opposition at all. And I'm really just trying to secure the Soviet Union against a future invasion by making sure that Eastern Europe is strong and tied to us. That's why I'm doing this. Had he made those intentions clear, we would have been angry about it. Don't get me wrong. The United States and Western Europe would have been angry that the people of Western Europe were not now going to be free to choose their own futures. But we might not have been as afraid as we were. Because since Stalin did not share that information, since Stalin did not make his intentions clear, it really allowed the imaginations of those of us in the free world to run wild with what he might be planning to do, with what he might be trying to do with these violations of the Yalta Agreement, with this Iron Curtain, with keeping Soviet troops in Eastern Europe. You've got to remember, we had just come out of a brutal war against a dictator, Adolf Hitler, who was clearly bent on taking over and dominating Europe, if not the world. And so when and Stalin, there's no doubt about it, was every bit the totalitarian dictator that Adolf Hitler was. And so, absent some sort of explanation from Joseph Stalin about why he had done what he did, the imaginations of those of us in the free world sort of ran wild with what he intended to do now. You think about it, when you don't know something, right? When something is unknown, your mind, the human mind hates a gap. The human mind hates the unknown. And absent knowledge, the human mind will invent things to fill in those gaps. And unfortunately, the human mind tends to invent the worst possible scenarios. You think about it, if you've never had a cavity filled, if you've never been to the dentist and had a cavity filled, your mind will run wild with how horrible it's going to be and what a painful experience it's going to be. When in reality, if you have it done, it's not as bad as all that. But absent that knowledge, your mind will generate the worst case scenario. And so absent any kind of clear statement from Stalin about why he was keeping Soviet troops in Eastern Europe, why he had built the Iron Curtain, why no free elections. And remember, coming out of the end of World War II, where we went in our minds was, oh gosh, he's another Hitler. He's going to try to take over Europe. He's consolidating his power in Eastern Europe so that he can begin the process of invading and taking over all of Europe. So domination of the European continent, perhaps even domination of the world, was what we expected Joseph Stalin was up to, or up to trying to do, when he did all those things in 1946. And so, with the assumption that what Stalin was planning to do was now expand communism at least into the rest of Europe, and probably aggressively, it was up to the United States to decide how we wanted to deal with that. And one option, of course, would be to not deal with it, to go back to the United States that we had been after World War I, a United States that withdrew into itself and did not remain active in the world and didn't try to affect things in the rest of the world. So we could have done that. We could have withdrawn back into isolation and sort of let nature take its course in Europe. But the attitude of many people in the United States was that we shouldn't do that, that the war against Hitler had been awful and that he had come way too close to winning it, and that we couldn't now back away and allow another totalitarian dictator to kind of take over Europe. Many Americans felt like that would make our efforts in World War II a wasted effort. So doing nothing did not seem to be a good option. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, going to war against the Soviet Union, that didn't seem to be a good option either. The Soviet Union was very powerful in Eastern Europe. The forces of the Soviet army far outnumbered that of the United States in Europe. It would have been extremely difficult to drive the Soviets out of Eastern Europe militarily, and it's questionable whether the American people would have even supported it at that time. So President Truman, in a sense, was forced to come up with a policy that represented something in between. And with the help of some thinkers in the U.S. Department of State, which is the department of the U.S. government that deals with our relations with other countries, the United States developed a policy for how to deal with communism. And it became known as containment. And the way that the containment policy worked was like this. It said, the United States will not attack communism where it already exists. Okay? The United States will not attack communism where it already exists. That would be Eastern Europe, for example. But we will work actively to stop communism from spreading. So the United States will not attack communism where it already exists, but we will work actively to stop it from spreading. This was called containment. So the idea is that we will contain communism within the boundaries of where it's located now. We won't attack it, but we're also going to do everything we can to prevent it from spreading beyond those boundaries. And that became the policy of the United States, really starting by the end of the year 1946, in response to Stalin's violations of the Yalta agreements. The United States adopted this policy of containment. And as we go into the year 1947, that's where we stood. But almost immediately, that policy seemed on the verge of being challenged or even overthrown. As early as February of 1947, a revolt had broken out in Greece. And as a matter of fact, this revolt had been brewing for some time. In Greece, there was a pretty strong communist movement. During the war, these sort of militias had formed to try to fight against first the Italian and then the German invasion of Greece. The Italian army and then the German army had invaded and taken over Greece. And there were armies that formed to fight against that invasion. And these were non-professional armies. These were militiamen who had organized themselves to try to defend Greece against invasion. And they had done very, very well. Greece is one of the most mountainous countries in Europe, and these militias had used these mountains to their advantage. They had basically defeated the Italians and really made problems even for the Germans when the Germans took over. Now, when the war ended, these militia did not disarm. They were, many of them, communists, and they were led by a communist leader. And they now were seeking to overthrow the government of Greece and take over and establish Greece as a communist country. They were being supported by other communist countries in Europe. And it seemed by February of 1947 that they were on the brink of victory, that it was very, very likely that the communist rebels were going to overthrow the Greek government and establish a communist dictatorship there. There was also some evidence that a similar revolt might take place in Turkey. Joseph Stalin had indicated certain interests. He had made certain demands on Turkey and had even suggested that the Soviet Union might support certain nationalist rebels against the Turkish government. That had not happened yet, but because of what Stalin was sort of saying, there was some alarm, some concern here in the United States that might happen. So you were faced with an active communist rebellion in Greece that seemed on the brink of overthrowing the Greek government and establishing Greece as a communist dictatorship, and the potential of a similar revolt in Turkey. So in other words, within a matter of months after announcing this policy of containment, that the United States would not attack communism where it existed, but that we would work actively to stop it from spreading, within months of clearly making it the goal of the United States to prevent communism from spreading into other countries in Europe, it seemed that that policy was about to fail. It seemed that the policy of containment was about to fail almost right out of the box because it seemed Greece was about to fall to communism. And so, again, President Truman had to make a tough decision. So we've decided on this policy. Now, how do we enforce it? What do we do to enforce this policy? Do we send U.S. troops to join in this civil war that's going on in Greece? Do we deploy U.S. soldiers to fight in Greece to defend the Greek government? That didn't seem like a very realistic option to President Truman. Do we do nothing and allow communism to overthrow Greece and take over Greece and immediately prove our policy of containment to be a failure? That didn't seem like a good option either. And so President Truman went to the U.S. Congress, and in speaking to them, he basically asked them for $400 million worth of assistance to the government of Greece and Turkey, to the governments of Greece and Turkey, to help them fight against communist rebellions. And the way that he put it in his speech to Congress, he said, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to assist free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. I believe it must be the policy of the United States to assist free peoples," so the governments of Greece and Turkey were not communist governments, who are resisting attempted subjugation, who are resisting being overthrown by armed minorities or outside pressures, which was a soft way of saying communism. Armed communist rebels who are being supported by communist countries from the outside. So he argued to the US Congress that the United States must take it upon itself to assist governments that were not communist, that were facing rebellions by communist rebels and who were in danger of being overthrown by communism. And he was able to convince our Congress to do this. And so $400 million in aid from the United States flowed to Greece and to Turkey to assist them. Some of this aid came in the form of credits, money, with which the governments could purchase weapons to help them fight communist rebellions. And in some cases, it was provided in the form of directly giving weapons to these governments. The United States had built hundreds of thousands of airplanes during World War II. We now had some of those airplanes as surplus. They were unneeded. So in some cases, we gave them directly to the Greek government to help them take the fight to the communist rebels. And the policy worked. The Greek government, which seemed on the brink of being overthrown, was able to turn around the tide of their civil war against the communists and defeat them. And in Turkey, the feared communist rebellion actually never materialized. And so this became part of American policy, and it became known as the Truman Doctrine, which said that the United States would use our resources, not necessarily in the form of American troops fighting on the ground, but in the form of assistance, aid, support. The United States would use our resources to assist governments that were in danger of being overthrown by communism to help prevent them from being overthrown by communism. And so the Truman Doctrine was a way of practically implementing the containment policy. In the containment policy, we said we're going to actively work to stop communism from spreading. Okay, so then you say, well, how are you going to do that? Well, the Truman Doctrine answered that question by saying, we will provide the resources of the United States to assist these governments that are in danger of being overthrown by communism. And in Greece, and seemingly in Turkey, it had worked. Now, it's interesting. If you travel to Athens, Greece today, you may find a larger-than-life statue of President Harry Truman there. And that's kind of a surprising thing. We don't necessarily expect that when we're traveling in a European country to find a big statue honoring an American president. But in Athens, there is this larger-than-life bronze statue of Harry Truman in a small park, honoring his effort to assist the government of Greece in defeating the communist rebellion there. And those words that I spoke to you, the ones that he used to convince Congress to send aid to Greece, are printed on they're engraved into these granite tablets on either side of the statue, in English on one side and in Greek on the other, commemorating the establishment of what became known as the Truman Doctrine. So what the Truman Doctrine established was that you don't necessarily need the military of the United States to help countries combat communism. In this case, we had actually used our wealth. We'd used American wealth, American economic resources to help combat communism, and we'd done so successfully, helping the Greek government to overcome this danger of a communist overthrow. And so that idea was then expanded on by the United States later in the year 1947. So I'm taking you to the top of page 9. So this is former General George Marshall. George Marshall, during the Second World War, had been what's called Chief of Staff of the Army, which is to say he was the highest ranked general in the U.S. Army, which means that he did most of his work in Washington, D.C. I mean, it was his job to manage the entire U.S. Army and really lead the entire U.S. war effort during the war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was utterly reliant on General Marshall to do so. And so his name doesn't come down to us the way a lot of the battlefield commanders do. Guys like General Eisenhower and if you know a little bit about World War II, General Patton and General Bradley, General MacArthur, These were big names in World War II because they were battlefield commanders. George Marshall was not a battlefield commander. He was actually higher ranked than all of them. And so he did most of his work in Washington, D.C. When the war ended, he had retired. But then President Harry Truman asked him to serve as Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State is the person in the U.S. government who is in charge of managing the relations of the United States with other countries. And so at a time when we were coming out of one war, but seemingly in danger of another war against the Soviet Union, or at least this Cold War was beginning to erupt, President Truman decided he wanted an experienced military person to lead the United States effort in our relations with other countries. And so he asked General Marshall to be our Secretary of State, and he agreed. And General Marshall was very, very concerned about the situation in Europe because after World War II, Europe was basically devastated. There really wasn't a major country in Europe that was not left in complete ruins by the war. They had either been invaded or bombed or both. Think about Britain, had been bombed relentlessly by the Germans during the war. France had been invaded by Germany and then bombed as we prepared to take it back, and then we invaded France. Germany had been bombed and then invaded by the Allied armies. The Soviet Union had been invaded. Really, all of the countries, Italy, right, had been bombed and invaded by the Germans and us. And so really all of the major industrialized countries had been left completely wrecked by the war. Their infrastructure destroyed, railroads, bridges, ports devastated, their factories flattened, their cities ruined, their economies bankrupted. And that condition persisted after the war. I mean, you can see how all of the major European cities were left pretty much devastated. They had no infrastructure, they had no factories, they barely even had places to house their people. And Marshall had been studying the causes of the Second World War, and particularly the causes of the rise of totalitarian dictators. And he noticed how, in basically every case, in Russia, where Lenin rose to power, in Germany, where Hitler rose to power, in Italy, where Mussolini rose to power, they came to power in an environment of economic desperation. People were in bad economic shape caused by World War I or caused by the Great Depression or some combination of both. People were in bad economic shape. People didn't have jobs. People were impoverished. And, people were desperate. And what Marshall noted was that when people are desperate, they will take desperate actions in order to get themselves out of that situation. They will turn to extreme political ideas and extreme political leaders in order to get them out of that situation. They had done so in Russia, where they had turned to the Bolsheviks. They had done so in Italy, where they had turned to Mussolini and the fascists. They had done so in Germany, where they turned to Hitler and the Nazis. And Marshall was very alarmed because it was clear that once again, now after World War II, Europe was again in a state of economic desperation. There was widespread poverty. There weren't jobs because the factories and the infrastructure were wrecked. And now Marshall was particularly concerned that with fascism defeated and overthrown, he feared that the extreme political leadership that people would turn to try to save themselves from this desperate situation was communism. He feared that in places all across Western Europe, Eastern Europe had already become communist because the Soviets had conquered Eastern Europe and imposed communism now. But he feared that even in Western Europe, the people might sort of voluntarily turn to communism, hoping that it would solve their economic problems. And there was even signs that the Communist Party was growing in power and strength and influence in countries like France and Italy. And so George Marshall proposed a very radical solution. He suggested something called the European Recovery Program, the ERP, the European Recovery Program. And basically the way it worked was that the United States would offer up to $17 billion in aid to the European countries to help them rebuild their economies from the devastation of World War II. This was to be a gift, not a loan. So the United States was planning on giving $17 billion to the European countries to help them rebuild, to rebuild their railroads, their bridges, their ports, their factories, their cities, to bring themselves out of this desperate situation. And you say, well, my gosh, how did the United States have $17 billion to just give away like that? Well, remember, we were the only country that didn't come out of the war totally devastated by it. You know, the war had not really touched us. We had oceans separating us from our enemies. There were no bombers that had a long enough range that the Germans or the Japanese could use to bomb the United States. As a matter of fact, the United States economy had come out of World War II stronger than it had been when it went in. When it went in, we still had the lingering effects of the Great Depression. Out of World War II now, the United States economy was very strong. And as a matter of fact, think about it. If any countries in the world wanted manufactured goods, they basically had to buy them from the United States because their own economies, their own manufacturing sectors had been devastated. Japan too. And so money was flowing into the United States. So from Marshall's perspective, the United States easily had the money to give away $17 billion to the Europeans in order to help them rebuild after the war. And he had several things in mind in proposing this. For one thing, he would argue it was the right thing to do, the humanitarian thing to do. Marshall definitely believed that the strong and wealthy and powerful have an obligation to assist the weak and powerless. So there was a moral component to Marshall's suggestion that the United States should pay to rebuild Europe. But of course, the main component of it was anti-communist. Remember, Marshall believed that if people are desperate economically, if people are impoverished, they will turn to radical or extreme political leaders and radical extreme political ideas in order to get themselves out of that desperate situation. So Marshall argued, if we rebuild these economies, if we help rebuild the European economies, that will help them get out of that desperate situation. And if they're not desperate, if their economies are functioning, if people have jobs, if they're no longer impoverished, they're much less likely to turn to communism. And let's not forget about the fact that if the United States made this gift to the European countries, perhaps that would cement the loyalty and the affection of those countries to the United States and not to the Soviet Union. But his main point was that if economic desperation leads people to turn to desperate and radical and extreme political systems, then let's get rid of that desperation. Let's rebuild Europe. Let's pay to rebuild Europe so that people aren't desperate, aren't impoverished, so they don't turn to communism as a solution. So there was a clear anti-communist component to the Marshall Plan, to the European Recovery Program. I'll explain how it became known as the Marshall Plan in a second. So there was definitely an anti-communist component there. And also, although it was a gift, there were strings attached. In order to receive money from the United States to rebuild, these countries had to establish a plan for maintaining a market economy. That is, they had to establish a plan so that they would allow a capitalist economic system to function in their countries. So although it was a gift, not a loan, they were not expected to pay them back, these countries were expected to maintain a type of an economy like the one that the United States believes in, a market economy or a capitalist economy. So in all these ways, the Marshall Plan had a anti-communist component to it, which was probably one of the main motivations. Also, in the long run, it would benefit the United States. As Marshall pointed out, the United States during the war had our factories running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to manufacture war materials. Now that the war was over, there was a danger that we would, go back to sort of running our factories 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. But what would that do to jobs in the United States? As American soldiers were coming back home needing jobs, if our factories weren't producing as much as they were during the war, there was fear that our country could plunge back into a Great Depression with mass unemployment here in the US. But on the other hand, if we helped rebuild the European economies, then the Europeans could start buying American manufactured goods again. Not tanks and trucks and bombs, but vacuum cleaners and cars and radios and washing machines. And so the thinking was, if the Europeans had to spend all their money on rebuilding, they wouldn't be buying American manufactured goods, and that would be bad for our economy. But if we paid to rebuild Europe, then for a time, they would have money to spend on consumer goods like our factories could now produce, and that would keep our factories running and keep our American people employed. And so Marshall sold this idea to the US Congress. I mean, you can see there are many, many arguments in favor of it. You know, it seems crazy. You're giving away $17 billion. But there were many, many arguments to do it. There's the humanitarian argument. It's the right thing to do. There's the anti-communist argument. It's a way of preventing the spread of communism. That is, it's in line with our policy of containment. And then there's the economic argument that it will actually rebound to help the US economy, not hurt it. And so the US Congress approved of the program, and aid began to flow to Europe. And you can see that France and Britain received by far the largest amount of money from the Marshall Plan. They had been our allies during the war. But you'll notice that even Italy and West Germany, the western part of Germany, received large stacks of money from the United States for rebuilding as well. We would have rebuilt the eastern part of Europe also. That money, the offer of money to rebuild was also extended to the Eastern European countries, but Joseph Stalin would not allow them to receive it. He fully understood the anti-communist component of the Marshall Plan, so he did not allow the Eastern European communist countries to receive money. We'll get more into that in the next lesson. You notice I keep referring to it as the Marshall Plan. That's how everybody referred to it, except for George Marshall. Marshall was way too humble, and he was quite embarrassed by the fact that the plan eventually took on his name. Officially, it was always called the European Recovery Program, but nobody called it that. They called it the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan definitely restarted the economy of Western Europe and was essential to the rebound, the return of prosperity in Western Europe coming out of World War II. And it did work. None of the countries that received Marshall Plan money ever turned to communism. So that'll do for this particular video lesson. And I hope that as we move forward, we'll talk about Stalin's response more and how, as a result of these things, Europe became actually increasingly divided between the free world and the communist bloc. But until then, take care of yourselves, try to stay healthy, try to stay safe. I'll look forward to teaching you again, modern world history students. Bye-bye.